Today, we are going to have, I think, a very timely and very pretty awesome presentation by Dr. Caitlin Williams. She is the postdoctoral fellow here at the Center of Excellence for Children in State Custody. She got her doctorate degree in clinical psychology from George Mason University and completed her pre-doctoral internship in child and family trauma at the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences program. She then completed a postdoctoral fellowship in child and family therapy at the Cherokee Health Systems in Knoxville, Tennessee, and is now completing a second postdoc. Hooray for second-year postdocs. I did that too, here at the Center of Excellence for Children in State Custody. And she is an excellent presenter, very knowledgeable about working with kiddos and families who have experienced trauma and who are involved with the child welfare system. Today, I'll let her introduce her presentation and speak to us. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for talking to us today.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I appreciate your flexibility and commitment to still joining the presentation. We had a little bit of a mix-up, but it's nice to see folks joining and hearing a little bit more about where some of you guys are coming from. So I'm going to talk today about rediscovering resilience in the time of COVID. And we're going to start off by pondering this question: is this going to last forever? This seems to be the question that is on everyone's mind. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to, define resilience. We are also going to cover a little bit of the recent research on resilience, particularly relating to resilience during the time of COVID and also resilience among our child welfare population. We'll go through some skills to cultivate resilience at multiple levels. And we will also work a little bit on identifying our personal resilience reminders. So ways that we can remind ourselves to practice and grow in our resilience. And then there'll be some resources as well that I'll provide to access additional information about the topic or about various kind of skills that we go through today as well. So March 2020, what did that bring us? Brought us a global pandemic. And I have this crater picture here because I heard a couple years ago a really helpful metaphor or analogy for talking about collective trauma, and in particular, in this case, talking about the pandemic that we've gone through or we're still going through. And trauma can be like a crater. So mass impact comes out of nowhere. We have no idea what's coming when it hits us, and when it does, it can leave a crater in our personal lives, in our family relationships, and in this case, broadly, globally, we see the impacts of the COVID pandemic and that shared collective trauma at every level of society. And so what do we do when we have a crater like this or an event, whether it's a specific trauma or more chronic, ongoing maltreatment exposure that can completely sort of destabilize us and put us in a place that we didn't think we would ever be in? And so this is our nice sort of graphical representation of what most of us felt like, I think, when March 2020 hit. And I also want that metaphor to kind of stay in mind as we continue through today's presentation. So trauma or maltreatment, or in this case, COVID, as a crater. And resilience. Resilience looks a little bit different, sort of depending on that shape of the crater, who all's in the crater with us, whether it's, again, sort of that individual level thing, or in this case, a global context. So we're going to do a little reminder video here in case anyone doesn't remember this original viral video. I'm going to play that for a little context.
Yeah, this is real life.
Okay, now I have 2 fingers.
Good.
4 fingers.
4 fingers. No, don't put that in. Don't put it in your mouth. Yeah, don't touch it. Don't.
Why can't I touch?
Because it'll mess up the stitches.
Your 4 eyes.
Yeah.
I feel funny. Why is this happening to me?
It's okay, bud. It's just from the medicine. Okay? Hey?
Is this
No, no, it won't be forever.
All right, so I played that video for a couple reasons. And the first one, I hope is obvious with his adorable little question of, is this real life? Is this gonna last forever? Is this how this is gonna always be? Is this how this feels? And his dad is going back and forth and giving that information. No, this isn't gonna be forever. It's not always gonna be like this. And it's a beautiful example in the moment of a resiliency building strategy, which we'll come back to later. But it's also a nice reminder, and this is the first thing that popped into my head when I was preparing for this presentation, of this feeling that it's ongoing, that it's gonna be forever. This is our new normal. We hear that phrase a lot. And so if that's the case, our job is still to figure out how to be resilient within this new normal, or within this new context, this crater. And so this, again, being our March 2020 crater, our before, if you will. And this is where we're headed next, March 2022. So it's obviously a different crater, but the idea here being that over time and with some resilience practicing, we can start to make meaning or make some growth in this crater. And in this case, it's only been 2 years. We're also still in the pandemic. We're still very much, especially depending on where you live globally, but in this country included, in various stages of the pandemic. And at the same time, there have been some things that we have, whether we know it or not, worked on individually, with our families, collectively as society, to start to sow some seeds for growth and for some resilience within the context still of this crater, or this total change in the landscape that we thought we had pre-March 2022. So resilience, for anyone who's familiar, I don't know her. A lot of people are like, what is resilience, right? It's this really nebulous construct. It's also fairly new to our field of psychology and our concept of how we think about recovery from trauma, which is, again, a little bit new of a concept. We talk a lot about trauma, and the impacts, but we don't talk as much about recovery, moving on from that. And so growing from that trauma. And that's where resilience really comes into play. So my goal for the end of this presentation is that you will indeed know a little bit more about resilience and be able to put some of these strategies to use. So briefly, I want to cover some definitions of resilience, because this has really varied across time when we've started studying this as a field, and also it can vary across contexts. And so overall, though, when I'm talking about resilience today, I'm talking about positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. So keeping in mind this phrase I really like, I stole it from somewhere on the internet, not sure which meme it came through as I was preparing for this, but advancing despite adversity was a phrase that I saw. And I thought that was a really nice summation of this concept. So keep that in mind if that's a little bit easier to remember. It has a nice ring to it, advancing despite adversity. So with that, resilience is a process. It's not an endpoint. It's not a static place that we reach and we can say, I am now resilient. The goal is that we're building and growing within this process throughout our lifetime. And so keeping that in mind for our work, and my work in particular, as a clinician and therapist, that means that I need to be thinking about resilience from birth all the way through the lifespan, and not just focusing on one orientation or one event and resilience to that. But how can I build up and promote resilience for my kiddos and families I work with, knowing that it will be a lifelong process? Another important point here is that significant, in terms of this significant adversity, is in the eye of the beholder. So I think we can all agree that COVID as a pandemic, it was a global event, a global collective trauma is what a lot of people are starting to, or we're already describing this pandemic as. And so that's a nice example of where, sure, everyone can sort of be on the same page that this was a significant adversity. However, that's not always going to be the case. There can be individual level events or even community events that maybe I wouldn't see as significant adversity, but someone else does. And so that perception and that context of the person who's on the receiving end of the event is what we really want to focus on. So even if I don't see something as significant adversity, that doesn't mean that it isn't for that person if they don't perceive it to be that way. So that's an important piece to keep in mind as well. And I saw another another really nice description of resilience and how it sort of operates on a twofold front. So resilience and growing in our resilience can both help us combat the development or the worsening of mental illness symptoms, and it can also help us promote our well-being. And so there's two related constructs, but they're different. And resilience can help us move along both trajectories. In addition, resilience is often talked about, especially in a lot of the sort of pop psych or media articles. I was reading through some, preparing for this presentation. A lot of people talk about resilience as just like, you know, do some coping skills, work on how you feel, change your mood, do a little mindfulness practice, and that's resilience, you got it. Not necessarily. So there's been more recent research to say like, sure, yes, your average everyday coping skills play into resilience, and they're not the whole picture. And in part, that's why we talk about them differently. Resilience as a construct is something different than coping skills. So keeping in mind that those are not interchangeable, but coping skills will feed into our resilience. And as always, but particularly when it comes to resilience studies, culture and context matter. And they matter in terms of resilience as a concept in and of itself. How do we in a Western focus, more individualistic society define resilience and study it versus how do other countries around the world and other practitioners examine and practice resilience? What does this look like in other cultures where maybe there isn't the same focus on individual success or individual ability? So understanding that resilience can function and look differently depending on where you are, and also again contextually. So what's going on within that situation? So on that front, social ecological resilience is something I want to focus on here. So what this really means is we're taking Bronfenbrenner's early work on social ecological framework. If that rings a bell for anyone from back in the days of schooling, we're taking this big framework right here and we're applying it to resilience. So why this is important is resilience doesn't function only at one level, right? Resilience functions at multiple levels, and using this model is a really nice way to see that. And so I pulled this quote because it really stuck with me and I want to share it with you guys as well. So getting at this idea that personal agency of individuals, so who I am at this individual level, my ability to seek out and get what I need is dependent not only on, sure, my ability to do that, but also the capacity and willingness of people and systems around me to meet those needs. So this can be like anything then can come across and make it more or less likely that we're able to be resilient. For example, COVID, maybe falling under this category of serendipity of life circumstances, made it a lot more difficult for people to access resources like social support during the pandemic. And so that's not something that's unique to me as an individual. That's something on a much broader level here, right? So really going out to maybe this macro system, but also looking at the chrono system, because over time, that has also impacted me. And so I wanted to pull this out because what this quote really says to me is that it's harder to be resilient for the people and where it's most important to be resilient. So I'm going to say that again, in part because I kind of fumbled it. It's harder to be resilient in places and for whom it's most critical to be resilient. So for example, if I live in a place that doesn't have much access to resources, I'm isolated, living at home alone, I don't have many social supports in this area, and any ones that I did are now online. Even if I really, really, really want to be resilient and do better in that situation, there's not capacity or willingness in the systems around me to allow for that to happen. So then I'm limited. So that's where resilience can be at the individual level all we want, and at the same time, it involves the interaction with systems around us, including family, community members, faith community, schools, teachers, but also more broadly, legal services, social services systems, media portrayals, moving all the way out again to those broader spheres as well. So this is the framework that I want us to keep in mind, that social ecological framework. And this is a nice depiction of what I was saying before too, about how resilience can help us on sort of two facets. So you can see on this side, if you're on sort of the top right of these quadrants here, I'm doing this to point to my own screen, realizing that you guys can't see that, but increasing or cultivating our resilience can both help us move toward greater well-being, so away from lower well-being toward greater, but cultivating resilience can also help us move away from or lessen symptoms of mental illness over time. So the ideal quadrant we want to operate in, or at least I'll say the ideal quadrant I want to operate in, is this one on the sort of top right? So ideally having higher well-being and low or no symptoms of mental illness. Potentially a little bit more difficult in the time of a pandemic, right? But that's why we have some of these other quadrants here as well. So maybe I'm having lower well-being because I'm in the pandemic and it's really weighing on me. I'm a frontline worker. And at the same time, I've cultivated resilience over my lifetime to be at a point where I'm having lower or lesser mental illness symptoms as well. Even if my well-being is low, I'm still operating in a resilient sphere around my sort of mental health capacity as well. So I found this quadrant to be really helpful, not only for helping figure out sort of like, okay, where am I on this, but also where are a lot of the families I'm working with and where is realistic to try and move toward by, again, sort of implementing and growing and practicing some of those resilience skills. So some more recent resilience research, which is a huge tongue twister for me. So I am surprised and happily surprised that I got it out in one mouthful. The most up-to-date recent resilience research we have is showing us again what I kind of said in that definition, that resilience is dynamic, meaning it's ongoing as a process, and also that it's multifaceted. Going again back to that social, ecological, those spheres of influence. It's not just at the individual level. It's not just at the family level. It's all of those different components. And it's also not just one type of resilience. So a way that I practice or demonstrate resilience might be different than how one of my clients does. And that's okay. Resilience captures all of that because, again, it's that multifaceted construct. Focusing a little bit more on some of the kiddos that I work with, and I know a lot of us work with as well, a lot of us who are on this call, maltreated children in particular. There's not a ton of research that's great in this area. So if anyone's looking for some research ideas or projects, resilience among DCS involved kiddos is a great topic area. But what we do know and what we're able to see from some of our longitudinal studies, or studies over time, show that across the board, maltreated children demonstrate less resilience across various domains of resilience, but also over time. So this is, of course, compared to their non-maltreated peers, but I want to highlight too that if maltreatment occurs earlier on, so in early childhood maltreatment, we're more likely to see those less resilient outcomes over time, if that makes sense. So timing of the maltreatment, and in particular early childhood here being like 0 to 5, 0 to 6. So for those really young kiddos that we work with where maltreatment is at play, this is extra important to keep in mind, that we need to be more attuned to how to help them as individuals, but also mainly in the family at that age, cultivate resilience. In addition, varying sort of depending on which study you look at, between 10 and 25% of maltreated children manifest or demonstrate resilience later in life. This one's a little tricky because I just said earlier in the presentation, resilience is not an endpoint, right? But we can still track it at points over time. And so what some of these studies have looked at is maltreated kiddos, their resilience, when they're still in childhood, and then looking later in their teenage years, even into early adulthood. And compared to non-maltreated peers, this number is a lot lower of kiddos who are able to manifest or show resilience across different domains over time. So these results are really showing that maltreatment does have a negative experience, right? A negative impact on functioning for the individual, but also for the family system. Again, especially keeping in mind for our DCS involved families we work with. And so there is some research that the timing of maltreatment or the type, so like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and then the chronicity, right? So was this the one time or was this chronic neglect, for example, over time? Those factors do seem to matter somewhat, but not maybe as much as we would expect. So what that tells me is that it's not necessarily falling back on like, oh, okay, this kiddo only had only had this one type of trauma and it was a one-time thing, I don't need to worry about them as much as I do this kiddo who's had a whole lot more happen over time. That can be an easy, I fall into this trap sometimes myself, right? Trap to fall into. And some of this research though is showing that that's not necessarily the case. And I go back to that idea of significant adversity is in the eye of the beholder. So that gives some important context for how this can be relative as well. So we need to be keeping an eye out and helping focus on resilience across the caseload, across the board of people we work with, not just focusing on those who have had the worst. In addition, some research on a more positive note has identified that there seem to be some turning points or some transition points developmentally where there are really unique opportunities and challenges that seem to be presented to kids and teens as they grow. But what those turning points can allow for is multiple chances to sort of bounce back from a decline in functioning. So we often think like, okay, kiddos doing okay, boom, event tanking, not doing okay anymore. So we want them to sort of bounce back and come back to that level of positive functioning they were at before. And also, that's not a one shot, that's it, right? You miss your chance to bounce back, you're done. No, what we're learning and what we're seeing both, I'm sure from our clinical practice, just anecdotally, but research is now showing too that there's multiple of these turning points or transition points over time, which again gives multiple chances for us to intervene in a way that can be helpful and protective. So that's the good news. The cultivating resilience is important across the lifespan, meaning that it's not something that if you miss the boat, you're not going to be able to be resilient. And also you'll have multiple chances and tries because such as life, there will be multiple significant adversities, most likely, that we have to rise and meet and through which we can practice those resilience skills. So specifically focusing on some recent research that's coming out during the time in the pandemic and looking at resilience during COVID. So I want to lay out just a situation. Consider for a moment just COVID and all of its impacts on an individual with stable income, housing, established support systems. Maybe they don't have a child who's in school, or they don't have children at all, maybe, or their children are out of the home. Compared with uninsured individual, they don't have their job anymore, they live in a small, crowded, multi-generational apartment, and how might they experience that COVID pandemic differently? We don't have to go into answers or anything per se, but I want you to reflect on that. And this is again an example of where significant adversity, sure, COVID is impacting all of us, but how COVID impacts us is different depending on what we bring to the table. And in this case, what we have available around us and those social ecologies to meet or not meet those needs that we have. So this is a really nice example pictorially that I'm going to return to later in the presentation about resilience essentially being this balance, or if anything sort of slated to the positive outcome side. But what has happened now during COVID is listed here, right? This is certainly not an endless list of both the negative outcomes or positive outcomes, but this is a nice example of sure ones that we have ourselves dealt with personally, or we know the families we work with have. So job loss, physical distancing, social distancing, closed schools, no childcare, losing people, grieving, losing family members, friends, coworkers. All of these things are falling really heavily and really quickly, at least is how it felt, I think, to a lot of us on the negative outcome side. Sure, maybe there's some positive outcomes as well, like the unemployment benefits that come in. There were the child payments that came in for families, maybe some high quality childcare since you could be at home with your kiddo if you've lost your job. And at the same time, I think most of us are feeling that tilt toward the negative. In particular, though, we are not alone in that feeling. So I want to reassure and validate if folks are feeling that way, that across the world, and in particular, 28,000 people participated in this study across 87 countries, and across the board, people report increases in negative emotions and decreases in positive emotions, which sets us up to be in a situation where resilience becomes critical and also really hard to practice. And in particular too, going back to for whom in this first example is this pandemic or these COVID outcomes going to impact the worst almost, or who's going to feel those impacts the most negatively. And the pandemic has just exposed what a lot of us already knew and experienced ourselves or experienced from working with families, but these life-threatening health disparities that we see coming out during COVID. And it's not only disparities in access to resources, and again, those social, ecological components of how we can seek out resilience, but also, again, that ability to use those resources as well. So how much at our individual level are we able to display that resilience? So we know there's some disparities, lots of disparities, in particular along racial, ethnic, SES, and ability status. So for folks who are immunocompromised or experiencing other disabilities, we have also seen these impacts be greater, which again pulls for resilience being more important. And at the same time, resilience being, again, more difficult to practice, unfortunately leading to sort of that catch-22. However, one positive recent research article, that's the same study that I was referencing that was across those 87 countries, they implemented a pretty basic cognitive coping intervention. So cognitive coping skill in terms of, here's the situation and how am I thinking about it? Am I praising it or thinking it through in a lens that's more positive or more negative? And engaging with an intervention that encourages a more positive reappraisal or positive cognitive coping in various situations related to the pandemic worked well. We don't have great data yet on long-term impacts of those interventions, but we do know that some of these practices in the moment can help us cultivate and build resilience. So on that note, switching gears a little bit to more sort of practical tips or suggestions or strategies that we can focus on, some of these roads to resilience. How do we build those? So the three main ways the three main ways really tie back to this graphic, right? If we think about it, if we're seeking balance, if resilience is being able to, again, find a balance between negative and positive, or if anything tip toward the positive, one thing we can do to increase our resilience is reduce sources of stress. Easier said than done, right? But say, for example, we lost our job early in the pandemic and then we found a new job. We have stable benefits again, we have a stable income, and we have a source of meaning potentially coming from that job. That is reducing that source of stress. Great. So anything we can do to reduce stress related to physical distancing, schools being closed, job-related stresses, wonderful. Let's do that. And also, I have found myself, and I'm sure I'm not alone, that reducing some of these sources of stress can be difficult in the pandemic because they're out of our sphere of influence. I can't control or change what the schools do, sadly. That means that I just have to deal with that, regardless of which way this falls. And so if it's falling on the side where schools are still closed, it's not a stressor I can decrease. It's a stressor I have to accept is on this negative side for me and figure out how to still flip that script or flip toward the more positive. The other example, great. Let's add some more supportive, responsive relationships to the positive outcome side. So during times of disaster or when we're trying to cope from something like COVID, significant adversity, adding in more support. So whether this is checking in on people more, offering free childcare benefits, offering more community services than we did pre-pandemic, for example, or flexibility with work and benefits and how we can do our work, whether working from home or in the office. Those are examples of things that individuals, but also communities and governments can add on service-wise to help increase the likelihood that we're able to display resilience. And then the third or the final way here is to figure out how we can move this fulcrum point. So not only how can we take or add on the sides of the seesaw, but what can we do within our individual core skills around resilience building to move that fulcrum point? Or for example, have it be like, okay, whoa, there's a lot more things on the negative side, lesser things on the positive, but I can move that fulcrum a little bit to make it more balanced because I have really strengthened and worked on my resilience skills up to this point. So a nice example of how you can change sort of where that balance needs to fall based on your own or your family's core sort of resilience skills. And this graphic, if it's helpful for anyone else, is linked here, but I realize some of the links may not come through on the PDF that is sent out. So if anyone wants me to send specific links from the presentation their way, please just feel free to reach out and we can make that happen. So switching again a little bit more into like the nitty gritty of what can I actually do, or what can we try to counsel our patients or our families around on the personal level. So again, going back to that sort of spheres of influence with Bronfenbrenner's theory here, we're focusing on the very center of that circle, so our own individual sphere. What things can we do to start building up our resilience skills? Going back to what we were just talking about with this intervention, we have some beautiful cognitive flexibility or cognitive coping skills. These are forming a cornerstone of CBT skills or cognitive behavioral therapy skills that we teach or that we talk about, or a lot of us have heard that acronym because we know we recommend it to our families when we're talking about therapy. This is a cornerstone of that. So the ability to engage in cognitive coping and to change how we think about or perceive a situation, that is a skill that we can practice in and out of significant adversity situations. For example, driving to work this morning and someone slows down in front of me suddenly and I don't know why, so my brain fills in that information. Do I go with a more negative attribution or a more positive or sort of meaning making filled attribution? And depending on which one I choose or which one I go with will shift, or at least it did for me, shifted my emotions or my affect, my feelings in that moment as well. And so being able to use this skill outside of situations of significant adversity helps us practice it or build that muscle up, which helps us then be better prepared for times when maybe there's another wave or a new variant or a whole other pandemic or a different type of adversity altogether that just happens to crater us while the pandemic is going on. So this is a really key, important one that is supported from several of those sort of intervention research studies we do have, and one that's easier to practice outside of sort of the high pressure situation where we might need to use it. Planning and problem solving skills. This is another one that's really critical here. So not only planning and preparing at a broad level, like what can I do to plan for when the school is closed next fall, and say it's May. So May 2020, schools are out, people are anticipating this probably won't go back to in-person in August of 2020. What can I do to plan ahead or problem solve to make it more likely that I can deal with that situation when it arises inevitably? So planning and problem solving, also excellent skills to build up and skills that you can cultivate in the moment in small stakes things like, I'm going to figure out how to plan or problem solve for my day, for my weekend. And to bigger stakes things like I'm going to plan for, again, that next school closure. I'm going to try and prep for next time around in a global pandemic. I'm going to start to stock some masks and, toilet paper or whatever it may be, going back to the dark days in the beginning. But that planning skill is one that also really helps us be prepared and practice resilience. Optimism. This is going back a little bit to the big 5 personality traits. So optimism or pessimism. You half full or half empty. When it comes to resilience, folks who cultivate are more likely to take an optimistic point of view or have an optimistic attitude about the world, tend to display more resilience. So if you're a person who's naturally optimistic, excellent, keep cultivating. If you're a person like myself, who maybe is a little more on the pessimistic side, it goes back to that first skill of practicing how to see more optimism or take more of that positive appraisal of the situation. Knowing that that will help, again, in the moment usually, but also prep us for later on. Faith and spirituality. Really important in terms of connection here. That doesn't have to be faith, it doesn't have to be spirituality, but if you are a faithful or religious or spiritual person, leaning into those beliefs during times of stress or adversity are shown to increase resilience, in part because we feel a connection not only with ourselves, but with others around us, with the beyond. So it helps increase that connectedness feeling, and also folks who are more or who have more of a spiritual practice and more of a faithful practice also tend to have some of these other attributes almost go along with it, right? So like more optimism, more empathy, more ability to see the good in others. Some of those things kind of tend to be associated with folks who practice more of a faith or have more of a spiritual practice as well. And if that's present for you, lean in, because that will be a beautiful way to help increase and cultivate that resilience at the individual level. Social support goes along with this. It's one of the ones that's most pointed to for our resilience literature of what's something we can do to help with resilience. Cultivate social support. Cultivate, lean into, strengthen your social relationships. So for me, this means adopting more cats. This means leaning into my existing friendships. This means trying to find new friendships. It means leaning on the supports of family or coworkers or other people who are going through a similar thing as me. And also working actively to maintain and strengthen those relationships. So social support is a huge way we can build our resilience in the moment, and also again, plan and practice and keep our resilience mindset for future significant adversities. Radical acceptance. I have this on here because it's a beautiful DBT skill or dialectical behavior therapy skill that was pointed to several times actually in some more qualitative or interview-based research studies around cultivating resilience in the pandemic. Radical acceptance at its ultimate is, I accept that this is happening and I have no control. That can be very hard to practice for some of us, myself included. However, the pandemic is a beautiful opportunity for that practice because there's literally nothing I can do to go back in time and change the pandemic from arriving or change how other people or how systems react to that pandemic. It's something that I have to say, this is out of my hands. I can only do so much, and I accept that this situation has happened. And what radical acceptance allows us to do as well is start to move forward. So I can't get out of the crater if I refuse to see that I'm in it. When I'm able to accept that this COVID pandemic rocked my world, changed the world, truly, accepting that is going to make it easier for me to then start to grow from that place of accepting that this is indeed the new reality and moving forward. And then on that nice note as well, another beautiful DBT skill, so dialectical thinking. What this means is that we can hold both the positive and the negative at the same time. So going back to that kind of seesaw, that fulcrum of cultivating resilience, it involves understanding, processing, accepting some of the negative emotions maybe, or like grief, loss, sadness, disconnection, and also finding ways to look to the positive. So with isolation, maybe folks got more time to spend by themselves and to enrich their lives with hobbies. Maybe they didn't work their job anymore because they were laid off. They had unemployment benefits and were able to figure out how they wanted to run this business that they wanted to do for years, but they didn't have the time before. So it's not discounting the negative, it's accepting the negative and also finding the positive and understanding that both of those can exist and do exist at the same time. That ability to adopt a dialectical thinking framework is also something on the individual level we can do to cultivate our resilience. Going one sphere of influence out toward family and community level. I have social support on here again because social support exists not only within our individual sphere, but as a family. Who are we connected to? Who are our social supports? Who do we lean on? Who do we call when we need help? Who do we call when we need to laugh? Who do we turn to when we need somebody to just take our kids because we can't be around them for another second? So having those social supportive relationships and that engagement with the community already in place will help us not only, again, have more of a resilient framework in the moment, but cultivate and practice that in the future as well. And some of these on the family and community side, I'm thinking about this both at a personal way, right? But also in this lens in particular for my families and who I work with. What can I do for my clients and my clients' families to help increase their resilience in some of these areas in really concrete ways? So maybe I'm suggesting, have you looked into see if there's like a parenting group in your neighborhood or something you can join for more support? Or What about your neighbor across the way? You know, helping people find connection and community, because we know that that is a way that the family resilience will also be able to be built up. Proactive access to resources. This is something that we know can really support families and communities in practicing resilience. So it's not saying, oh yeah, okay, here's some things that might help, and that's it. We're gonna throw some of these things to you after something terrible has happened, but it's proactively setting families up to be connected with resources that could be helpful. Is this childcare? Is this medical care? Is this specific legal resource? Is it, again, just connection with another person or another family? What can we do to proactively get our families set up with supportive, stable housing, with free childcare, with all of those kind of elements that help make day-to-day life easier? How can we connect them on the front end so that we're not having to scramble on the back, but we're able to face that next significant adversity as a family with some of those resources already in place? Family coping skills. I have this on here because things like family problem solving, family mindfulness activities, family emotion focused coping. So not just that you're doing with your individual kiddo and not at the individual level, but as a unit, as a family unit or group, building up coping skills, whether it's through family-based therapy interventions or whether it's through just weekly sort of family meetings that you're cultivating and practicing these coping skills. These are things that we know will build their resilience as well. Flexibility within rituals and routines. So not saying overly rigid to this is how it's always been and this is how it's got to be now, without acknowledging maybe the impact of that adversity, or for, in this case, COVID, but being able to be flexible within still our structure is something that we know will help boost families' resilience over time. So not totally getting rid of rituals and routines and not staying super rigid and stuck to them, but being able to still keep those rituals and routines and adopt flexibility within them. Possessing realistic hope. I say this here is realistic because sure, I can hope that the pandemic's going to end tomorrow and everything's going to go back to normal. Is that realistic hope? No. So hoping for something that's never going to be possible, sure, it might make me feel better in the moment, but it's not going to help me be more resilient or lean into that strength over time if I'm constantly hoping for things that are impossible. So possessing and enriching that realistic hope, whether it's hope for family reunification, whether it's hope that somebody will continue to work their firm plan, whether it's hope that grandma's gonna recover from COVID and get out of the hospital. If those outcomes are realistic from our perspective and family's perspective, encourage hope in those areas. I have this on here just briefly as a tie-in. I can come back to it if anyone's interested or has questions after, but there's something called a social emotional learning curriculum, or SEL. And having this type of curriculum in your school setting is a beautiful way to increase family and community resilience. I am not an expert on SEL, but I have recently learned a little bit more about it, and I'm happy to share additional resources if others are interested. But I wanted to add this on here to acknowledge that kind of school component for a lot of the kiddos and families we work with as well. And then systemic. So I have this in here as a way to try to increase the resiliency of the systems we work within. So I tried to focus on more healthcare or DCS focused systems and ways we can work to be sustainable within our work sphere or the system we operate in. So advocating for our needs as individuals within that agency, but also for a specific agency itself. So we don't have enough resources to man this phone line, and we need the phone line help because people are calling in with emergencies a lot. Advocating to have another position added or created so that there's more support on that team is a beautiful way to increase systemic resilience, or the ability of the system you work within to continue to respond flexibly to challenges. Opt-out workplace resilience interventions. This is a really nice suggestion I found in some of the more workplace or management focused literature around resilience. So instead of having it be something like, oh, here's this cool webinar you can come to if you want, you know, sign up here. It's everyone is enrolled in this resilience intervention that will be from 10 to 12 next Monday. And you have to sign in to opt out if you don't want to do it. More likely to have more people participating, but also when it's set up in that way of like, this is the expectation that we're going to be working and joining together to increase resilience as a system. It makes it more likely that people see that as a collective goal, be more likely to join and participate in those types of interventions. There's also something called the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. This is a wonderful resource for folks who are at higher up levels within their systems to look into if curious. There's a set of tools for how to cope with and deal with vicarious trauma, which if folks on the front line were not already coping with vicarious trauma, I would say, and a lot of research says that they certainly are now. So if vicarious trauma is something you're noticing in your workplace, there are toolkits, there are options for how to start to cope with and deal with that currently, but also, again, build resilience as a system, as a workplace later, so that you're less likely to experience vicarious trauma in the future. And again, more likely to be resilient in the face of that. The 3 Ps, prevention, planning, and preparation. So again, going back to this at a personal level, when agencies are also able to plan and prepare, they're more likely to be resilient. Beautiful example. If we have another pandemic that's not COVID come on in a couple of years, I bet that a lot of hospitals have started to adopt planning situations. So like, let's set up a steering committee to talk about how to handle this next time. What that does is allows us to learn from what happened before, but also put concrete things in place so that not if, but when significant adversity strikes again, we can be better prepared to be more resilient as a whole. I'm not going to go into this now for the sake of time, but this is on here, which has a lot of other ideas and ways that you can build individual, family, school, and community resilience. So I'll leave this on here as a resource slide for folks if they would care to look after. So I want to close with more of a discussion around personal resilience reminders. So going back to the slide about Bronfenbrenner's influence and where we exist within systems, I want to take us back to that sphere around where social services lie and where healthcare systems lie, because they're not at the individual level or even really the family level. They're sort of a third level removed. However, when we as individuals who work within those systems, so for me, it's healthcare, when I as a provider start to work with a family as their therapist, I jump into a circle ahead, right? I jump into that circle where teachers live, parents live, because I have direct contact with that kiddo, that individual now. And so I become, sure, part of this system that's more removed, but I'm the individual working with them. And so that closeness and that connection is what allows us to do our job well and to work alongside the families in the way that we do. However, that closeness can also be what drains us, because we're not actually in the core first final circle of the individual, right? So I can be the individual's therapist, but I'm still not the individual. But if I start to think that there's more of a blend there, that I'm in that sphere more than I am, that is going to drain my emotional capacity as a provider to be able to continue to work sustainably with families over time. So that closeness can make us better at our job, and it can also make us less resilient as providers over time. And so this is where putting that into practice, I at least, and I know many of my colleagues have found that difficult, of like, how do we maintain and cultivate the closest with people, but also understand that there is a distance that we have. And that distance though, and remembering that, is what can help increase our resilience as providers or professionals over time. So I want you guys to reflect on some of these questions after today, or potentially have some of these conversations in your head or with your colleagues. But what are your personal resilience reminders for work and for home and during the pandemic? And if they're not there, what can we start to set up as some personal resilience reminders for us? And I'm not sure if we'll have the time today. However, this is a beautiful resource that has recently come out during the pandemic as a way to add in our workplace in particular. And this was designed for people who work in healthcare and DCS systems to do what's called PNR. So if you take a medication PNR, the goal is that you can do this resiliency building strategy PNR or as needed. And so briefly, the goal is to step 1, P, pause, take a breath. Just take a moment, notice what's around you without judgment, engage. And when you're ready, switch to your reset. Ask yourself, what helps me reset in this moment? Is it doing my pop-it for 5 minutes? Maybe. Is it taking a quick walking break and refilling caffeine? Maybe it's that. Maybe it's checking Instagram. Maybe it's talking to a colleague. Maybe it's calling my mom or looking at pictures of my cat. What can I do to reset just in this brief moment? It's not going to take a long time, but something I can do briefly to reset. And then nourish. That's how we're finishing up this PNR process. So noticing again, going back to that initial noticing, what shifted, if anything, even if it's just a little. And if that worked, if we feel slightly more nourished, slightly more filled up in our cup, wonderful. Now it's time to practice that more and more throughout the day. So using this PRN strategy is something we can do in particular in the workplace, and also we can adapt it for ways to be and practice more resilience at home and in our communities as well. So I want to close with this image of Crater Lake. This is a picture I took myself, which I'm very proud of. When I first visited Crater Lake, I was stunned. It's truly awe-inspiring and mind-blowing if you're able to go. But this crater formed thousands of years ago by a volcano exploding. And then researchers think, we don't really know, that about 250 years passed to now create what we have as Crater Lake. And so I have this as a beautiful closing reminder that the COVID pandemic, going all the way back to that first slide of that crater, that's where we are right now. And also maybe March 2270, I don't even know how to say those years, they're too far in advance. We might have something more beautiful and more unique than we ever could have conceptualized from the beginning when we were still in that crater. Closing out, any questions or comments? I know we're a little bit low on time. I appreciate everyone sticking with me. So I can allow time for that. And then I have some resources on the last slide, which I think they're being mailed out. But again, if you want to learn a little bit more, there's great options all over the interwebs, but here's some things I cultivated and pulled together for you guys as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's so timely and so necessary. And I think I really appreciated the time you took to, just consider everybody in the picture, right? Like, it's not just worrying about the resilience of the kids that we're working with, but that like how important our own resilience is, and how to foster that, I think, and just kind of viewing that holistically. I think that's just so incredibly helpful to do. Somebody did just post in the chat, may I have her email address to request the SEL resources she referenced?
Sure.
Yeah,
and I have several others going. There's been a phenomenal series on resilience, an 8-week series that I've been participating in, and they had a whole section on social emotional learning and resilience in the school. So that was wonderful for me because it was a brand new area, but there were a lot of resources that came from it. So I have more we can send as well.
all right. Well, I want to again thank Dr. Williams for speaking to us today and taking the time to present this information to us, which I think is incredibly useful. I want to remind everybody that we will post a recording of this presentation on our YouTube channel. We'll email out to everybody on our mailing list once we've made that posting. And I want to let everyone know that we will not be having a learning cafe next month due to spring break. And so in March, we will not have a learning cafe. And in April, our learning cafe presentation is actually going to be on the 4th Friday instead of the 3rd Friday. The 3rd Friday is Good Friday, and I know a great many of you are out not working that day. And we didn't want to skip 2 months in a row. So we're going to have it on the 22nd, and we'll have Dr. Mark Scheck-Snyder coming to talk to us about how to support parents of children who experience anxiety, how to effectively do that using a new treatment approach called the SPACE approach, which should be pretty exciting. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send us an email and let us know. We hope to see you all in a couple months.